This is the overview for Futato chapter 20, and as you can see, this chapter is about cal stem infinitives or cal pattern infinitives. Now, in case you don't remember from English, an infinitive in English is something we usually translate to and then the verb, as in down here in paragraph 20.2, to run. That would be the infinitive form of a verb. So to run, to walk, to eat, to sleep. If it has the word to in front of it, the verb is occurring in the infinitive form. Now, Hebrew has two infinitives, as the first paragraph here indicates. One is called the infinitive construct. The other is called the infinitive absolute. They both have definite and distinct forms, and there's only going to be one form for each. These are not, as Futato points out here in the first paragraph, these are not conjugated things like your regular finite verbs, the regular verbs we've been seeing up to this point, whether it's perfect, the cal perfect, or the cal imperfect. They had person and number and gender. Third masculine singular, third feminine plural, all that kind of stuff. Well, infinitives, you're not going to have that, so there's not a lot to memorize here at all. There's a basic form for each of these. You will not have person and number. You'll never have a third masculine singular infinitive. You'll never have a first common plural infinitive. It's just an infinitive, and there are two kinds, the infinitive construct, the infinitive absolute. Now, he starts with the infinitive construct. The form, the basic form, as we can see here, is exactly like the imperfect with the prefix of the imperfect removed. So as he says here in 20.3, the form is related to the imperfect. Remove the prefix and you have the infinitive construct. So the basic form using the paradigm lemma katal would be ketol. So you have a shva under the first consonant, and then a cholam, an O vowel, as your last vowel sound. So ketol. And we get that if you look at the imperfect right here, we'd have yiktol. If we take the prefix off, what we're left with right over here is ketol. So we have shva cholam, and that's going to be the primary pattern for infinitive constructs, shva cholam, shva cholam. Just fix that in your mind. Now, it might be a compound shva. If, for instance, our first consonant is a guttural, then we're going to have one of the compound forms like a hatef patak or something like that, but it's still a shva. It's shva cholam, shva cholam. That's sort of the pattern for the infinitive construct. Now, if we go down here, he talks about other vowels. For instance, if the imperfect has a patach, like here with yikbad, it's still going to be, right here, shava, but not cholam. It's going to stick with that a vowel. So whatever the imperfect form is, you take off the prefix, and that's what you're left with, so kavad. So this is one of the exceptions. Again, it's usually shava cholam, but with an A-class vowel in the imperfect, it's going to retain that A vowel. Now, frankly, if you look at this form, just look at this. Look at kavad. Have you ever seen anything like that? The answer is no. You should be able to know that this is not a perfect. For starters, there's no ending, so you would think without a prefix, without a suffix, that would be your third masculine singular form. Well, your third masculine singular form is sort of like your lemma form. It would be, if it was, let's say, davar, it'd be davar, something like that, or kavad or shavad or something like that. You wouldn't have, here's the point, you wouldn't have a shava under the first syllable if this was the perfect third masculine singular. And obviously it's not an imperfect because we lack a prefix. So if you see this, if you see a shava underneath the first syllable, and because you know your vocabulary that this is a verb, You see that shva. That should be your first tip-off that we're probably looking at an infinitive here. In fact, 99 times out of 100, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be an infinitive. So they're not difficult to spot, even if they don't go with the normal pattern of shva holum. You get that shva under the first consonant, and there's no ending, obviously no prefix. 99 times out of 100, that's an infinitive construct. Now, an infinitive construct can have a pronoun suffix added. Right here are some examples to the end. When that happens, it's naturally going to affect the way you would translate something. It would actually be it could be a subject or an object, and I don't want to get too far into that. When we actually get into examples, you'll see what that means. But just note here that for this point in your reading, that suffixes can be added. He goes on next to weak roots have different forms. Now I want you to watch this. Again, weak verbs are always a problem because they do different things. But let's just look at the consistency, because most of the time this is consistent. Take the first one. Here's your root, Gayan, Mem, Dalet, Amad. What do we have here? Shva holum. That's your infinitive construct. Again, it's the consistent pattern. So it doesn't really matter that this is a compound shva. It's shva holum. You see that? Think infinitive construct. Over here, we have 3 consonants and then a suffix. Now, if you know your vocabulary, and again, absolutely critical, up to this point, you have seen these suffixes attached only to nouns. That's how you learned them. So when you see a suffix attached to a verb, you know this is a verb because you know your vocabulary. Your first thought should be, I wonder if this is an infinitive construct. Okay? When you have suffixes that are attached to verbs and the suffix forms sort of a direct object, you're actually going to have a different tip-off for that. So we'll hit that when we get to that point. But for now, when you see a suffix attached to a lemma you know is a verb, not a noun, it's a verb, think infinitive construct, because this will happen a good deal of time. Next one, third guttural. What do we have? Shva holum. We have the helping patak here, but it's still shva holum. Again, can take a suffix. First yod. Now here we have something different. And it's going to happen, watch this, with first yod and with certain first noon verbs down here. It does not have a normal shva holum. It has a T ending. And it's always going to have sagol, sagol, shevet, geshet. Whenever you see, again, you would have to know your vocabulary. And really, it's a little more difficult here because the yod drops. But whenever you have, let's just put it this way, a word that ends with a T, a tav, with 2 sagols, shevet, geshet, think infinitive construct. And in this case, it's going to retain that T before the suffix. Okay? So again, there's not a lot of memorization in this chapter, but there are things you have to sort of take note of. Down here we have shva holum with other first noon types. Here's our geshet again. That was irregular. Third hey, we have shva holum, but it's going to end with a T. It's going to actually have the ot ending, just like a feminine plural noun. But it's not a noun. It comes from gala, but you still have shva holum. So you should be thinking, okay, shva holum, that must be infinitive construct from galat. Well, I don't have galat in my vocabulary, but you do have gala, and so you remember that, hey, with other things, sometimes the hey turns to a vav, or excuse me, turns to a T, a tav. So that would be, again, just a memory device here that would help you isolate these. What it really comes down to is you're going to see kind of the same sort of verbs, third hey verbs, then this sagol, sagol pattern. You're going to see these, and they really won't be anything else. And it's actually going to be easier to remember it's an infinitive construct than it might seem at this point. But they're not really like anything else, and so that helps. Now I have this whole box here in yellow because it's really important. There are some verbs, and the usual suspects are in here, that take odd forms of an infinitive construct. Now, yatsa, we haven't had much trouble with that. That's not one that's been irregular very often, but that will be irregular with infinitive construct. The form is tsate, silent aleph, tsate with a tav at the end. And of course it'll add a suffix to that. So that one's odd. You should make a note on that, write that down somewhere, make a little list. And here are our usual suspects for weird verbs. Halak, we already know that behaves, like a first yod verb elsewhere. Well, it does it again here. Just like we saw above, some first yod verbs, when it's the infinitive construct, they have this segol t thing going on. Same thing with halak. It'll be lekhet in its infinitive construct form, and then it will add a suffix to that t. Another usual suspect, natan. That one's been irregular because of the two noons, the one at the beginning, one at the end, and they assimilate into other things, into the following consonants. That one is also going to add a tav, and guess what? The final noon is going to assimilate into the added tav, and then the first noon is going to assimilate into the original tav, and here's what you get, tate. Now, this one you should just write down and memorize, tate. Know that it's the infinitive construct form of natan. You just have all this assimilation stuff going on. So tate, that is one you just need to commit to memory cold. Because when it adds a suffix, look what you get. It'll have tito or tit, whatever the suffix is. You'll have two tavs right in a row, and it's going to be an I-class vowel, just like tate is, and a suffix. Again, just memorize the tit form with a suffix. It's from natan. You'd never be able to guess it. You just have to memorize it. So natan is sort of a sore spot here. And then finally, third usual suspect, lakak. We've already learned that behaves like a first noon verb. And as we saw above, some first noon verbs take that t at the ending. But in this case, it doesn't have segol t. It has patak. So kakat is the infinitive construct form of lakak. And again, it'll retain that and then add a suffix to the t. So this box gives you all the weird ones. So make a special note of this, the content there. Now uses are again really translations. When you have an infinitive construct that is preceded with the lamed preposition, okay, like here we have lishpot down here, and then we have lishpot with a suffix, we would translate it like an English infinitive, to judge. And down here, to judge, and then the suffix becomes an object, to judge you. So again, there are a couple things to commit to memory here. When a preposition lamed is added to an infinitive construct, translate it like a normal English infinitive, to whatever the verb means. And then when you have, in that situation, a suffix added, the suffix is the object of that verb, that infinitive construct verb, to judge you. Now you could translate it to reflect purpose, like in order to judge you. I don't think Furtado does a super job of bringing the purpose out. I think in order to conveys that a little bit more, and that would be an acceptable translation. So just know you could have just a generic to whatever for the infinitive with lamed. Here, lamed with infinitive, it might be best to translate it in order to, again, to express a purpose idea. Whatever you think the context fits or justifies. Another note, infinitive constructs are negated by bil-t. Now this is just going to be a vocab word. It just means no or not, like lo. our familiar negator would. So when you see Bill T, you should be suspecting that that negative is probably negating an infinitive construct. So you should go looking for an infinitive construct for this to negate. So here we have one. Here's Bill T. Here's our infinitive construct. Here's Shiva Holam. Down here, Shiva Holam. Down here we have Shiva Holam, even though we have the T and then a suffix added. And again, look at how it's translated. Not to see, there's our infinitive, him. The suffix is the object of the infinitive construct. Now you can also have an infinitive construct that gets preceded by kaf or bet. So this is going to work a little bit differently. When you see bet and kaf prefixed to a verb, think infinitive construct. Of course, here it's easy. We have bet, and then we have Shiva Holam. Here we have kaf and Shiva Holam. Okay, again, that pattern is consistent. That tells us it's an infinitive construct. But what I'm telling you to remember here, because of the last example, we don't have a Shiva Holam. We lose the vowel pattern. When you have a verb, and you would know that shamar in this last example is a verb because you know your vocabulary. When you have a verb prefixed with bet or kaf, be thinking immediately that you have an infinitive construct situation, an infinitive construct form. Now, above here, let's just scroll up here. We saw that when we have an infinitive construct and then we have a suffix, the suffix to this point has been serving as the object of the infinitive construct, to see him. There's the third masculine singular suffix gets translated him. It's an object of the verbal. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes if we go down here to the situation here with bet with an infinitive construct and we translate it temporally, again, we don't translate it like the normal infinitive to whatever. Bet or kaf are translated because they're translated when, like right over here, because they sort of set a time for the verbal action. That's why they're called temporal, a temporal use here. So when you have this, you have bet, verb form, you think, oh, infinitive construct, and it's a bet. That means it's temporal. That means I'm going to translate it when. So when something, when guarded us or we, or again, you're going to have to consider that we have our suffix anu could also be the subject of the infinitive construct. So when we guarded, again, could be object, could be subject. You're typically going to be able to tell by context and by sense as well. But typically, if you have a lamed prefixed, it's going to be to, then the action of the verb, and then the suffix will be the object. But when you have bet and kaf, in most cases, in fact, you're going to have the suffix function as the subject of that infinitive construct. Again, you need to be thinking of both object, subject, but this is the way I can tell you, this is the way it's going to be working for the most part. It's going to be when, and then you should look at the end for your suffix, a subject, and then the meaning of your verb. So when we guarded. So bet and kaf, again, temporal. And when you see a suffix attached to that infinitive construct, consider it. Think of it first as, does it work as the subject in that phrase, translating that form into a phrase, into something meaningful. Because that's typically what it's going to be. Now, sometimes infinitive constructs are used with time words like yom. We just saw a temporal use. But sometimes the writer will use yom to give that temporal sense. So we have here, we need to, I think, go a little bit over. We just did that. So bayom, there's in a day. We're just going to be woodenly literal here. In a day, up, melok, Shava holem, it's an infinitive construct. So in a day the king ruled or reigned. Well, it doesn't really make much sense. You should remember, I mean, look at this. We have be yom. If we had just this be attached to the infinitive construct, you'd translate it when, if it was prefixed like that. So that might help you, again, just for a mental a way to memorize these things, or a way to remember them. Just translate bayom as when, rather than try to come up with a phrase in a day, because that's not going to sound very good in English. But when the king reigned, or you can have in the day when the king reigned. You need that when sense. You need that temporal sense. So that's why Futado has it in parentheses. In the day when. Again, if you want to include that, you could, but you'll often find English translations that just skip that and just make it when. Again, that's not very literal, but it captures the point. So read through this, and again, try to come up with a good way to remember that yom before an infinitive construct is sort of, again, like bet or kaf. It's a temporal indicator. Scroll down here to infinitive absolute. There's a specific form for this. It's going to be ka tol. It's going to have a kametz and a holem vav. Okay, that's your pattern. So you go down here, infinitive construct is shava holem. Infinitive absolute will be kametz holem vav. And again, 99.9% of the time, it's going to be that full spelling holem vav. We saw above, you could have holem vav over here, but you're going to have that shva. So if it's shva holem or holem vav, it's going to be infinitive construct. If it's kametz holem vav, it's infinitive absolute. So both of these infinitive forms, these are cases where you need to note the vowel patterns and memorize them. And there's only two of them, two patterns: shava holem, kametz holem vav. That's all you need. Obviously, there's more to the chapter than that, because there's a lot to think about when you see one, especially when suffixes get thrown in there and all that stuff. But as far as memorizing forms, right here you got it. This is the chapter right here in terms of forms. Again, except for the exceptions with the weird verbs, a couple first yod, some first noon, that sort of thing. But again, just read through that. It's actually fairly consistent, except for, again, a few weak verbs. The note here, only third hey verbs vary from the standard paradigm. So this is good news. Only one weak verb does anything different. So here's our regular pattern, our strong pattern, kametz holem vav. Third hey, though, look what we have. We have kametz and then holem, and we could have kametz holem vav without the final hey. So here we have the final hey, and it's just a holem. You say, well, how would I know the difference between that and the infinitive construct? Right here. It's a kametz. It has to be an infinitive absolute, not an infinitive construct. This is your pattern. Kametz, holem, or holem vav. That's an infinitive absolute. It's only going to be a construct if this is a shava. So again, the patterns up here are pretty important. And again, in some cases, you will lose that third hey. So that those are just odd ones. Use of the infinitive absolute, a number of uses. One of the most frequent is introduced here. He only gives you one, so that's all we need to worry about. Sometimes you will have an imperfect form, and then right next to it, an infinitive absolute form of the same lemma. And when that happens, you want to translate it with some sort of emphasis. So look here. Here's our absolute, shamor. There's kametz holem vav. Shamor, tishmor. So we have an infinitive absolute and an imperfect, but it's the same lemma, shamar. Naton, yitanu. Yashov, neshev. Whenever you have absolute and then an imperfect, absolute and imperfect, absolute, imperfect of the same lemma, you want to translate it with some sort of emphatic English. So you will certainly guard. This is actually the formation in Genesis 3 with you shall surely die. With the serpent speaking to Eve. Or you shall not surely die, okay? In that case, it's negated. This is the formation right there, the so-called emphatic formation. Infinitive absolute plus imperfect of the same lemma. So this is all you need to really know about the infinitive absolute in terms of translation in this chapter. So most of your work here, that's the end of the chapter, most of your work here is really going to be reading through this carefully and remembering some of the exceptions, the geshet, the sagol, tav at the end, and the odd verb forms in that square that I had all colored in. You're going to have to go back and really focus on those, but there's not a lot of memorization. It's just a lot of things to remember in this chapter. So that is the overview of Futaro, chapter 20.